Toys R Us was not beaten. It was raided. In 2005, the biggest toy shop the world had ever built became the target of a corporate takeover. And the investors who took it over did not come to sell toys, they came to strip it for parts. They bought Toys R Us for about $6.5 billion, and here is the trick at the black heart of the deal: they barely paid a cent of their own. They borrowed the money, used it to buy the company, and then forced the company they had just bought to pay that loan back. The buyers kept the prize. The giraffe got the bill. A healthy 70-year-old institution, a business that had done nothing worse than sell slightly overpriced Barbies, was quietly buried alive under a mountain of its own borrowed money, and then blamed years later on a website. Because make no mistake, it was not really Amazon that switched off the lights, and it was not the internet. It was a spreadsheet, in a boardroom, signed long before a single store ever went dark. This is Flatline. One dead company on the table a week, cause of death only. On the table tonight, Toys R Us. And the cause of death is not the one you were sold. Let me rewind you to where it all still felt safe, which for most of us, was the greatest building a small human could ever be turned loose inside. If you grew up when I did, Toys R Us was not a shop, it was a pilgrimage. It was a big low box the size of an aircraft hangar, and stepping through the doors was like walking into the inside of a toy box the size of a supermarket. An entire aisle of nothing but Lego. A wall of bikes. A fortress of board games stacked to the ceiling, and that smell, new plastic and fresh cardboard. The smell of a very good afternoon about to happen. There was a jingle, and you already know it. I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid. That was not an advert. That was the entire business model, printed on a single line. Do not grow up. Keep the childhood coming. Keep restocking the shelf. There was even an industry name for what Toys R Us was, a category killer. It walked into the toy business, planted its flag, and cleared the board. Small toy shops could not compete on price, and quietly folded. Department stores handed over their toy floors without a fight. For one long golden stretch, if you were a kid in the Western world, and you wanted a toy, there was really only one temple in town, and it had a backwards R and a giraffe named Jeffrey. So how does the shop that owned childhood end up as a going out of business banner, flapping in a car park? The version you have been handed is cozy and simple. Amazon happened, the internet happened, and a big slow dinosaur of a store couldn't keep up. And look, that version isn't wrong. It's just the last laziest page of the story, and it skips the part where the wounds were already fatal. Because the bleeding started long before anyone was scared of a website. The first cut was self-inflicted, and Toys R Us signed it with its own hand in the year 2000. It looked at this strange new thing called online shopping, decided it was too much like hard work, and did something that looks completely unhinged in hindsight. It signed a 10-year deal to make Amazon, a company that, back then, mostly sold books, its exclusive online toy store. Read that again. The largest toy retailer on the planet handed its entire digital future to the book website, agreed to be the only toy seller on that site, and pointed its own web address straight at Amazon's checkout. For a few years it even looked clever. Toys R Us got to walk away from a business it didn't understand, and Amazon got a flagship toy department for free. But Amazon, being Amazon, quietly started slipping other toy sellers onto the shelf anyway. Toys R Us sued, and years later it even won around $51 million and the right to walk away from the deal. But it had won the argument and lost the decade. While it was busy fighting that lawsuit, it had built no real website, no warehouses, no delivery, no online muscle of its own, because it had outsourced every bit of it to the one company that was quietly measuring it for a coffin. It had handed the car keys to the getaway driver and asked for a lift, but a slow start online is survivable. Plenty of shops were late to the internet and lived. What turned a cut into a killing was the second Bled, and this is the bit nobody prints on the poster. In 2005, a group of investors, the private equity firms KKR and Bain Capital, together with the property company Vornado, bought Toys R Us and took it private in a leveraged buyout worth about $6.5 billion. Now, leveraged buyout sounds like the sort of phrase designed to make you stop listening, so let me translate it, because it is the whole game. A leveraged buyout means you buy something using mostly borrowed money, and then, in the magic trick, you make the thing you just bought pay back the loan you used to buy it. The company takes out an enormous mortgage on its own head, hands the cash to its brand new owners, and is then told to go and earn its own ransom. Overnight, a healthy, profitable, 70-year-old business that had never done anything worse than sell slightly overpriced Barbies was strapped to around $5 billion of debt. That's the diagnosis. Everything after this is just the patient bleeding out in slow motion, so let me walk you through the chart. Because that debt did one very specific, very lethal thing. It ate the money. Toys R Us was now shoveling something like $400 million out the door every single year, just in interest, just to keep the loan alive. $400 million a year. That is the exact money you would have spent cutting your prices to knock out Walmart. That is the exact money you would have spent building the website to knock out Amazon. That is the exact money you would have spent making your tired beige 1990s stores feel like somewhere a kid wanted to be. Gone, all of it, every year, out the loading dock, straight to the banks. Toys R Us walked into the most brutal decade in retail history with a piano strapped to its back, and the owners told it to sprint. So watch the dominoes, because they fall exactly where you'd expect. The stores got shabbier, because there was nothing left to spruce them up. The prices stayed high, because there was no room to drop them. The website stayed a joke, because there was no cash to fix it. Batteries not included. Future sold separately. Every quarter the finish line drifted further away, not because Toys R Us couldn't see the danger, but because it flat could not afford the cure. It hadn't been built to sell toys anymore. It hadn't been rebuilt to feed a debt, so let's mark the time of death. On the 18th of September 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, still buckling under roughly $5 billion of debt it had been dragging around for 12 years. The plan was to reorganize and live. It didn't. One week Christmas, a jittery crowd of suppliers, and a bank of lenders who had finally run out of patience, turned a rescue into a wake. And in March 2018, the company waved the white flag. It would liquidate, shutting or selling every one of its roughly 735 American stores, and handing some 33,000 people their last shift. Everything must go, at last, literally. And here is the detail, almost too cruel to say out loud. Charles Lazarus, the man who founded Toys R Us 70 years earlier, the man who dreamed the whole cathedral into being, died that very same week. Days after the company he built announced that it too was checking out. The giraffe outlived its own creator by about 7 days. Now for the finding, the single line I would actually write on the death certificate. It is not killed by Amazon. Score that out. Amazon and Walmart were just the weather. The debt was the disease. What killed Toys R Us is that a perfectly healthy company was turned into a piggy bank, bought with borrowed money, ordered to pay for its own purchase, and then shoved, exhausted and skint, into the fight of its life. The private equity owners didn't necessarily set out to kill it. They set out to drain it. But when you wring every spare dollar out of a business to service a debt you bolted onto its back, you don't leave it lean and hungry, you leave it defenseless. Every single move made perfect sense on the owner's spreadsheet. And lined up end to end, in a tidy little row, they marched a beloved 70-year-old giant straight into a dumpster with a store closing sign taped to the window. So here's the takeaway. The X-ray to stick on your fridge. There is a very particular way to kill a great company, and it never shows up dressed as a competitor. It shows up dressed as a rescue. It arrives as smart money in a very good suit, promising to unlock value, and the only thing it actually unlocks is the front door, so the furniture can be carried out. We've laid a few of these out on this same table. Kodak clutched its film. Blockbuster clung to its late fees. Nokia married its keyboard. But Toys R Us never even got to clutch anything, because its pockets had already been turned inside out. The most dangerous thing that can happen to a healthy business isn't a rival. It's the day someone works out you're worth more drained than you are alive. Toys R Us could have grown old behind the till. It simply wasn't allowed to. It was mortgaged to the rafters, marched into the future with empty pockets, and left to explain to a whole generation of kids why the temple had gone dark and the giraffe wasn't coming back. Somewhere in the summer of 2018, a kid walked out of a closing down Toys R Us, clutching one last markdown box, past a giraffe that no one would be paying anymore. He didn't know he was leaving a funeral. None of us did. That's the thing about growing up. You never clock the last time until the doors are already chained. So there's your autopsy. The Toys R Us kid finally grew up, for one very grown-up reason. The shop that swore he'd never have to, could no longer afford to keep the promise. Game over. Please take your receipt. And I'll see you on the next slab.